She just won $500 million. The check sat in her hands, massive and official, proof that her life had finally changed. She was shaking when she dialed his number. Sarah Mitchell could barely contain her excitement as she told her husband James the news that would reshape their entire world. But that same night, when she walked into their kitchen in suburban Atlanta, she froze. Her hands began to tremble. There in the dim light of their home, she saw her husband standing over a steaming cup of tea. His expression changed the moment he noticed her. In that single moment, 3 seconds of eye contact between a husband and wife, everything she believed about their marriage, about their future, about the man she had spent nearly 25 years with, shattered completely. What she saw in his hands would reveal a betrayal so dark, so calculated, that it would make international headlines and force people everywhere to question how well they really know the person lying next to them every single night. This is the story of Sarah and James Mitchell. And it's not just a story about lottery money or crime or betrayal. It's a story about trust. It's about what happens when a marriage built on decades of shared life suddenly collapses under the weight of desperation and rage. It's about the masks we wear in front of the people closest to us and what happens when those masks finally crack. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Back to Sarah and James. Who was this man? Why would someone who had supposedly loved his wife for 2.5 decades decide, in a moment of panic, that her death was the answer to his problems? What was he truly capable of? Was this a crime of passion, something desperate and unplanned? Or was it something far more calculated, something that had been building in the shadows for much longer than anyone realized? And most importantly, what were the red flags that Sarah had missed? What signs had she ignored? How had she not seen that the man she married was capable of murder? These are the questions that haunted not just Sarah, but everyone who heard this story. And as you listen to what happened next, you'll find yourself asking those same questions over and over again. Sarah Mitchell was born in Atlanta, Georgia. She grew up in a middle-class family where hard work and education were the paths to stability. Her father was a factory manager, her mother was a teacher, and they instilled in their children the values that would define Sarah's entire adult life. She was the type of person who showed up early, finished her work on time, and saved her money carefully. As an adult, Sarah became an accountant. She worked for a mid-sized firm in Atlanta for nearly 18 years. She was reliable. She was quiet. She wasn't the type of person who asked for promotions or demanded recognition. She did her job well, and she went home at 5 o'clock. On Friday evenings, Sarah had a ritual. She would stop at the grocery store and buy a single lottery ticket, always Powerball. She'd been doing this for 17 years. Her friends thought it was silly. Her family thought she was wasting money. But Sarah saw it differently. That ticket represented something more than a chance to win. It represented possibility. It represented the idea that maybe, just maybe, the universe had something different planned for her than another 40 years of spreadsheets and tax calculations and living paycheck to paycheck. She never told anyone about these dreams, but they were there. She wanted to travel. She wanted to see the world. She wanted to experience the kind of luxury and freedom that most people only read about in magazines. James Mitchell was different from Sarah in almost every way. He was outgoing, charismatic, handsome in a way that made people trust him immediately. When Sarah met him at a company networking event in 1994, she was immediately drawn to him. He was a financial consultant, educated, well-dressed, and he spoke with such confidence about money and markets and investments that Sarah felt like she'd met someone who truly had his life figured out. James had a way of making people feel like they were the most important person in the room. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married. Sarah had found her person. She believed James was the partner who would help her navigate the world, who would protect her, who would be by her side through everything life threw at them. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man she married was beginning to unravel. By the time they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, James's consulting business had started to struggle. The financial crisis of 2008 had hit him harder than he'd let on. The recovery had been slower than he'd admitted. By 2015, James was deeply in debt. He was taking out credit cards he didn't tell Sarah about. He was losing sleep over payments he couldn't make. And the closer Sarah came to retirement, the more desperate he became because he knew what was coming. He knew that when retirement hit, when their income stabilized into a fixed amount, when there was no more opportunity for growth or sudden windfalls, his debts would crush them both. But he never said a word to Sarah about any of it. Instead, he maintained the appearance of success. He still wore expensive suits. He still suggested expensive dinners. He still played the role of the confident, capable man Sarah had married. But behind the scenes, something far darker was developing, something that had taken root years ago and was growing stronger with each passing month. It was a Friday in May, 2019. Sarah was at work, reviewing client accounts, doing what she'd done thousands of times before. She opened her email and saw a message from the Georgia Lottery Commission. Her heart stopped. The email was notification that she'd won. Her Powerball ticket from the previous Friday had matched 5 numbers. But there was more. She'd also matched the Powerball itself. The payout was one of the largest in Georgia lottery history. $500 million. Sarah read that number over and over. $500 million. In that moment, everything changed. She walked to the parking lot. She sat in her car for 10 minutes, just holding her phone, staring at that email, unable to fully process what was happening. This was real. This was actually happening. At 2:47 in the afternoon on Friday, May 17, 2019, Sarah Mitchell's life fundamentally altered. She called her lawyer first. She called her accountant second. And then, with her hands shaking, she called her husband. The phone rang twice before James picked up. He was at his office in downtown Atlanta. Sarah could hear the ambient noise of his workplace, the sound of phones ringing and people talking in the background. When he answered, she could barely control her voice. She told him she needed to talk to him about something important. She told him she was coming home early. James asked her what was wrong. Sarah said nothing was wrong, quite the opposite. She said everything was right. She said something amazing had happened. For a brief moment, James probably felt relief. Maybe he thought she'd gotten a promotion. Maybe he thought something good was finally happening that might ease the financial pressure he'd been hiding from her for so long. Sarah told him she'd just won the lottery. She told him the amount. She heard nothing on the other end of the line. Not excitement. Not celebration. Not the reaction of a man whose wife had just announced that all their problems were solved. There was silence. And then, very quietly, James said he needed to see her. He said he'd meet her at home in an hour. Sarah hung up the phone and felt a chill run through her body. Something was wrong. Something in his voice had told her that winning $500 million might not be the good news she thought it was. When James left his office that afternoon, he wasn't celebrating. He was panicking. He was calculating. He knew exactly what Sarah's win meant for him and for their marriage. Under Georgia law, lottery winnings acquired after marriage are often considered marital property, but there are exceptions, especially when the winner receives the money in their own name, as Sarah had. James understood financial law because he worked in finance. He understood that this money might not be split between them in a divorce. And he understood that if Sarah wanted to leave him, she could now afford to do so. He also understood that at 60 years old, with nearly $400,000 in personal debt that Sarah didn't know about, he was facing financial ruin. On his drive home, James made a decision. A decision he would later claim he didn't remember making clearly. A decision he would try to justify as impulsive and unplanned. But the truth is, what James did that afternoon was methodical. He stopped at a pharmacy and purchased something he'd been planning to obtain for months. Something he'd researched online. Something that would solve his problems. He bought ricin. Ricin is one of the most deadly poisons on Earth. It comes from the seeds of the castor bean plant. 1/100 of a milligram is enough to kill an adult human being. It has no taste. It has no smell. It's almost impossible to detect once it's dissolved in food or drink. James had obtained the ricin through encrypted dark web forums 3 months earlier. He kept it hidden in his office, in a place Sarah would never find it. He told himself he would never use it. But on that afternoon drive home, with his world crumbling around him, he changed his mind. He went home and he waited for Sarah. Sarah pulled into the driveway at 4:15. The afternoon sun was beginning to move toward the horizon. The house looked the same as it always did, the suburban dream home they'd bought together 15 years ago. But nothing was the same anymore. She unlocked the door and set down her purse and her car keys. The house was quiet. She heard movement from the kitchen. James was there. He was standing at the counter with his back to her. There was a kettle on the stove. There was a cup. There was a tea bag steeping in hot water. And there was James, reaching for something in his pocket. Sarah saw his hands. She saw the small container in his right hand. She saw him beginning to pour the contents into the cup. And in that moment, Sarah understood. She understood that the man she'd married wanted her dead. Not because he was angry. Not because he was violent. But because she had money and he had nothing, and he couldn't control her anymore. She understood that he had planned this. She understood that he had intended to make tea for her, to watch her drink it, to wait for her to become sick, and then to wait for her to die. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. James turned and saw her. His face went white. He froze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Sarah looked at her husband. James looked at his wife. And the marriage that had lasted almost 25 years ended right there, in that kitchen, in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah's voice, when it finally came, was steady and cold. She asked him what he was doing. She asked him what was in the cup. And James Mitchell, backed into a corner with nowhere left to hide, told her the truth. He told her about the debt. He told her about the desperation. He told her about the ricin. He told her about the plan. He told her that he loved her, but he couldn't lose everything. He told her that he couldn't be poor. He told her that he couldn't imagine a life without control, without money, without the respect that came with success. And Sarah, listening to her husband confess to attempted murder, called 911. The police arrived at the Mitchell home at 4:55 in the afternoon, a little over an hour after Sarah's call. By the time the officers walked through the door, James Mitchell had handed the poisoned cup to the first officer on the scene, showing them exactly what he'd done. He was cooperative. He was calm. He was almost relieved, as if confessing was the first honest moment he'd had in years. The cup was carefully photographed. The remains of the liquid inside were tested. The results came back positive for ricin. The amount found in the cup was more than enough to kill a person, probably within 24 to 48 hours of ingestion. Sarah was taken to the hospital for examination to ensure she hadn't ingested any of the poison, even in trace amounts. She was cleared. She was also completely alone. Her husband was arrested that evening and charged with attempted murder. The news spread quickly through Atlanta. By the next morning, it was on local news. By evening, it was on national news. By the following day, it had gone viral. A man, a woman, a lottery win, an attempted murder. It was a story that had everything. The media descended on the Mitchell house. Reporters stood on the lawn. Everyone wanted to know why James had done it. Everyone wanted to understand how a man could try to kill his wife over money. The investigation into James Mitchell's background revealed something that made the story even more complicated. Detectives discovered that James had not acted entirely on his own. He had confided in someone. A woman named Jessica Cole, a woman he'd been having an affair with for 2 years. Jessica worked in data analysis at a tech company. She was intelligent. She was attractive. And she had encouraged James to go through with his plan. In recorded conversations, Jessica had given James the contact information for obtaining the ricin. She had helped him research different poisons. She had told him that Sarah was the obstacle to his happiness. She had told him that killing her was the only solution. James had been someone she could control, someone she could manipulate. And when the plan failed, when Sarah didn't drink the tea, Jessica Cole disappeared. She vanished from her job, from her home, from her entire life. She became a fugitive, and no one could find her. The FBI was brought in. Missing persons posters were distributed. Jessica Cole's face appeared on news broadcasts across the country. She was added to databases of wanted criminals. But she had planned her escape carefully. She had money. She had fake identification. And she had nothing left to lose. The investigation into James Mitchell's financial situation revealed the depths of his desperation. He had nearly $500,000 in debt across multiple credit cards. He had taken out a second mortgage on the house. He had borrowed money from loan sharks. He had been getting calls from collection agencies. Sarah, when she found out, felt something between rage and heartbreak that she could barely articulate. The man she'd been married to for almost 25 years had kept this secret from her. He had lied to her every single day. He had acted out a role of success and stability, while underneath it all, he was falling apart. The trial of James Mitchell took place in the Superior Court of Fulton County, Georgia, 6 months after his arrest. James had confessed, so the trial was not about whether he'd done it. The trial was about why he'd done it. It was about motive. It was about his state of mind. It was about whether he'd planned this murder, or whether it had been an impulsive act driven by desperation. The prosecution's case was straightforward. James had purchased the ricin 3 months before the attempted murder. He had hidden it. He had researched poisons extensively online. He had discussed the plan with Jessica Cole multiple times. And then, when Sarah won the lottery, he decided to act. This was premeditation. This was murder with intent. A forensic psychologist testified on behalf of the state. She described James as exhibiting narcissistic personality disorder. She said that men like James require absolute control. They require admiration and respect. And when they lose control, when their world begins to crumble, they often resort to violence to maintain their sense of power. The psychologist explained that Sarah's lottery win represented a threat to James's identity. It meant he was no longer the financial provider. It meant his wife would have resources he couldn't control. And in his mind, the solution was to remove her from the equation entirely. The defense argued that James had been acting in desperation, that he'd been having a mental health crisis, that he'd been manipulated by Jessica Cole. They argued that he hadn't actually intended to go through with it, that the purchase of the ricin was more of a fantasy than a real plan. But the evidence didn't support that story. Cell phone records showed James researching how to administer poison without detection. They showed him discussing the plan with Jessica. They showed him purchasing supplies. They showed him planning this murder methodically and carefully over the course of months. Sarah testified at the trial. She walked into the courtroom and faced her husband across the room. She told the jury about their marriage. She told them about the man she'd loved. She told them about the moment she realized that man was capable of murder. She was composed during her testimony. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply told the truth. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 3rd day, they reached a verdict. Guilty of attempted murder. The courtroom filled with the sound of Sarah crying, finally allowing herself to break down now that it was over, now that the truth had been officially declared. James Mitchell was sentenced to 22 years in prison. He would be 78 years old if he ever got out. But the story didn't end there. The story took a turn that nobody expected. In 2022, 3 years after James Mitchell's conviction, law enforcement received a tip. A woman matching Jessica Cole's description had been spotted in rural Oregon. She was living under an assumed name, Jennifer Mills. She was working as a librarian at a small public library in Bend, Oregon. She was volunteering at a community center. She had built a quiet life off the grid. When the FBI arrived at her cabin in the woods, Jessica came out peacefully. She didn't try to run. She didn't try to fight. She simply accepted that she'd been found. In interviews with federal agents, Jessica explained why she'd helped James try to kill Sarah. She said that James had promised her he would leave Sarah. He'd promised they would be together. He'd promised they would use the money from Sarah's life insurance to build a new life. He'd made her believe that killing Sarah was the only way they could be together. But when the plan failed, when Sarah didn't drink the tea, Jessica realized the horrible truth. She realized what she'd done. She realized she'd almost been responsible for a woman's death. She realized James had been using her. He had never intended to leave Sarah. He had been manipulating her the same way he'd been lying to Sarah. And the weight of that realization had destroyed her. That's why she'd run. That's why she'd disappeared for 3 years. She said she couldn't live with what she'd done. She said she'd created an entire new identity because she couldn't face who she'd been. She was sentenced to 12 years for conspiracy to commit murder. But here's where the story becomes even more complicated, even more human. Sarah Mitchell decided to visit Jessica Cole in prison. Not to forgive her, not to absolve her of what she'd done, but to understand. Sarah needed to understand how someone could go from being a normal woman with a normal life to being willing to help plan a murder. Sarah visited Jessica every month for a year. They sat across from each other in visiting rooms. They talked. And over the course of those conversations, Sarah began to piece together a picture of two very different women who had been manipulated and destroyed by the same man. Jessica told Sarah that James had been having affairs throughout his entire marriage. He told Jessica that he'd told Sarah about them. He told Jessica that Sarah had accepted it, that their marriage was open. All of it was a lie. James had been lying to everyone, including himself. In 2024, almost 5 years after James Mitchell's conviction, something extraordinary happened. New evidence came to light. Evidence that hadn't been available during the original trial. Recorded conversations between James and Jessica that had been recovered from encrypted servers showed that Jessica had been the driving force behind the murder plot. She wasn't simply a woman who'd been manipulated. She was the architect. She was the one who'd suggested the poison. She was the one who'd researched it. She was the one who'd repeatedly told James that killing Sarah was the only solution to their problems. The new evidence suggested that James had been a man in crisis who'd been manipulated by a woman who was far more calculating than anyone had realized. James's defense team filed for a retrial. And suddenly, the case that had seemed simple, the case of a desperate man trying to kill his wife for money, became far more complicated. The judge agreed that the new evidence was significant enough to warrant a review of the original conviction. The legal process began again. Sarah found herself back in court, back in front of her estranged husband, forced to relive the worst moment of her life. This time, though, she had something she didn't have before. She had understanding. She had context. She understood that James wasn't simply an evil man. He was a broken man. He was a man who'd failed and didn't know how to live with failure. He was a man who'd been manipulated by someone far more dangerous than himself. What Sarah Mitchell did next shocked everyone who knew her. Instead of fighting the retrial, instead of pushing for James to remain imprisoned, instead of continuing to play the role of the victim fighting for justice, Sarah did something radical. She wrote a letter. In that letter, she acknowledged that James had committed a terrible crime. She acknowledged that he deserved punishment. But she also acknowledged that the complete picture of what had happened was far more complex than anyone had initially understood. She talked about how he'd been manipulated. She talked about how his mental health had been deteriorating for years. She talked about how his shame and his desperation had made him vulnerable to someone like Jessica. She didn't ask the judge to let him go free. But she did ask the judge to consider that justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes justice was about understanding. Sometimes justice was about rehabilitation. Sometimes justice was about recognizing that most people who commit terrible crimes are themselves broken in some profound way. The judge took Sarah's letter into consideration. He also took into consideration the new evidence about Jessica's role. He reduced James Mitchell's sentence from 22 years to 18 years. It was a modest reduction, but it represented something much larger. It represented a shift in how the case was understood. It represented a shift in how Sarah chose to move forward. She didn't spend her $500 million lottery winnings in anger. She didn't use the money to destroy the man who tried to destroy her. Instead, she used her wealth to create something positive. She established the Trust Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping victims of intimate partner betrayal. She wrote a book called When Love Became a Weapon that became a bestseller. She speaks at universities. She speaks to victims. She uses her story to help other people understand the psychology of abuse and manipulation and control. So what is the real story here? Is it a story about greed? Is it a story about the corrupting influence of money? Is it a story about control and narcissism and toxic relationships? The answer is yes to all of those things and no to all of them at the same time. The real story of Sarah and James Mitchell is a story about how two people can live their entire lives together and still not really know each other. It's a story about the dangers of hiding, of pretending, of maintaining a facade so perfect that the cracks underneath become invisible. It's a story about what desperation can do to a person. It's a story about how manipulation works. It's a story about how easy it is to become someone you never thought you'd be, how easy it is to make decisions you never thought you'd make, when you're backed into a corner and you can't see any other way out. But most importantly, it's a story about forgiveness and understanding. It's a story about how a woman who had every right to hate the man who tried to kill her chose instead to try to understand him. That takes extraordinary courage. That takes an extraordinary capacity for humanity. Now I want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have forgiven James Mitchell? Can you understand why Sarah chose the path she did? Or do you think she should have pursued the harshest sentence possible? Did the lottery money change the dynamics of their relationship in ways that made tragedy inevitable? Or was the tragedy always waiting to happen, and the lottery just exposed what was already there? These are the questions worth thinking about. These are the questions that matter. If you've watched this far, thank you. Thank you for caring about this story. Thank you for investing in understanding the complexity of the human experience. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. There are more stories like this coming, stories that will challenge you and disturb you and make you think about your own relationships and your own life in ways you might not expect. We'll see you next time.